Hello, everyone. This is Professor Jeffrey Miron. Miron, is it?
Miron.
This is Professor Jeffrey Miron. Professor Miron is a senior lecturer, and he's the director of undergraduate studies in economics at Harvard University. He also is at the Cato Institute, and he directs the economic studies there. And his method of his special interest, basically, is libertarianism and economics. So, Professor, the first question is kind of about libertarianism and economic thought. I was just wondering how you viewed the intersection of your libertarian beliefs and how you formulate that into your view on drug policy.
So my version of libertarianism is what people usually call consequentialist or economic or pragmatic libertarianism. That is, I'm not asserting that people have rights and government should never infringe individual rights and so on. I'm instead arguing, using sort of economic reasoning, looking at the consequences of intervention versus non-intervention, that even when society's private arrangements don't work perfectly, and they almost never work perfectly, even when they don't work that well left to their own devices, the government interventions that try to fix those problems typically make things worse or create unintended consequences that are even worse than whatever problems might have existed in those private arrangements. So the simple summary is that if government is the treatment is usually worse than the disease. And so having a disease is not good, but that doesn't mean the government treatment is going to make things better.
Of course. So the consequential part of your libertarianism is essentially a cost-based analysis where you're evaluating the impacts of government intervention, if that clarifies.
Exactly. And with costs and benefits construed somewhat broadly. So many cost-benefit analyses are focused on those things that you can count accurately and that you can convert into dollars so that you can add up the cost, add up the benefits, and then look at the ratio to see whether costs are greater or benefits are greater. In many applications, I think there are consequences of government intervention that are very hard to quantify, that are very hard to put a dollar figure on, but are nevertheless important. I mean, we could think about some of the interventions for COVID as an example. Okay? People are concerned that many of the restrictions and the lockdowns that governments have imposed, closing of schools, have contributed to worse mental health, for teenagers, as an example. Most people would agree that that's a cost of the restrictions, if that is indeed the case, if the facts support that. But how do you decide what the dollar value is of increased mental health issues for teenagers? It's not zero, but it's not some arbitrarily high number either. So it's often hard to say exactly what the magnitude of the cost and benefit is, but by looking at the whole range of possible costs and benefits, at a minimum, we recognize that we shouldn't just try to minimize COVID, say, by locking everybody in their houses. That might minimize the incidence of COVID, but it has other consequences that have to be taken into account.
Of course. So with that being said, I wanted to move to somewhere probably more quantitatively measured, which would be the budget and how drug prohibition actually can lead to excessive costs for the government. And I just wanted to talk about your research at the Cato Institute and how you found that through drug prohibition that increases costs. For example, state and local governments spend about $29 billion on drug prohibition annually. What are these factors that are leading to these excessively high costs? Perhaps that's police officers or other methods. What are the factors essentially contributing to this $29 billion?
You said it exactly. It's the criminal justice cost of hiring police who make arrests and prosecutors who prosecute the cases, judges who are involved in the cases, building prisons and hiring guards to work in prisons for those people who are arrested and convicted of drug crimes. Those are costs, budgetary costs that state and local governments and the federal government would not incur if drugs were legal, if they were treated like alcohol or tobacco or coffee at Starbucks or any other standard legal good. Now, that's not the whole story by any means. Okay, governments spend significant amounts trying to enforce the laws against homicide, as an example. The mere fact that it costs money to enforce that policy doesn't make it a bad policy. Okay, so the budgetary cost is only one part of thinking about the pros and cons of drug prohibition. Indeed, I would argue that even though I wrote that paper about the budgetary cost, I think that's a relatively small part of the negative generated by drug prohibition, by outlawing drugs. Okay, the even greater effects include the loss of liberty for the people who want to consume drugs and can do so without harming others. It includes the increased frequency of overdoses that occurs when drugs are sold in underground markets as opposed to being sold in pharmacies or other legal venues. Okay, so those costs are huge. Okay, the budgetary costs are not trivial, but I think they're only one part of the calculation, and it's important to recognize these other negatives of prohibition.
Right. Speaking about one of the specifics that you mentioned was the black market, essentially. And I think one very important point that a libertarian framework might bring up would be that under a world where you legalize all drugs per se, there's not necessarily a need for a black market anymore because the drugs are all legalized. What, in your opinion, what impacts might stem from that, whether that be in the criminal justice system, where there's not as many people resorting to these black markets? What do you think would happen to these illicit activities as they transition to a legalized framework?
So the basic framework that economists would use would say that if you outlaw something for which there is substantial demand and for which there are not ready substitutes, you're not going to eliminate that market. There will be a supply and demand of that commodity or those services. It will just move underground. Perhaps the prohibition will shrink the size of the market to some degree, okay, but not necessarily a lot. Okay, and the evidence suggests sort of moderate effects on the overall size of the market. So we'll still have a market in marijuana or heroin or methamphetamine or whatever, okay, but it will be an underground market. That means you have the budgetary cost of trying to enforce the prohibition. Okay, that's one thing we've discussed. Second, it means that there are much stronger incentives for corruption, okay, for drug traffickers to try to bribe the police and judges and things like that. Okay, it means that you are likely to have much lower quality control in an underground market than you would in a legal market, because the mechanisms that promote high quality, the absence of adulterated products being what they claim to be, okay, in terms of purity and things like that, okay, are much more likely to occur in a good way in a legal market. In an underground market, you're buying from someone you don't know, you may never buy from again. You can't go complain to the Consumer Product Safety Commission or sue the seller if it turns out you get a low quality product. And the evidence across all sorts of examples, from alcohol prohibition to marijuana prohibition to opioids more recently, is that when you drive the market underground, people end up buying adulterated and or products that are not the purity that is indicated, if there's any real indication. And so they accidentally consume excessive amounts, or they consume, say, heroin that's laced with fentanyl, which is much, much more potent per unit, okay, right, and then they accidentally overdose. Okay, so that's still another effect of prohibition. And going even further, if a country is importing these drugs in a black market and is being grown in a black market overseas, you encourage corruption in those countries that are growing and shipping the products to the United States, say Colombia for cocaine, Afghanistan for opium, Mexico for marijuana in earlier decades, China and Mexico for fentanyl recently. And so we're not only generating these negative effects in the US, but by exporting prohibition, we're generating similar effects or related effects in other countries.
Right. I especially see that one example that just came to mind was syringes, actually. So when the market is operating under a black market or illicit market, people don't want to say that they're taking these hard drugs, and they can use things such as dirty syringes, and that can spread diseases, I believe, such as HIV and AIDS.
Exactly. So I think there are a couple things that go into that discussion. The fact that, say, heroin is illegal doesn't directly mean that disposable syringes are illegal. Okay, those are separable policy questions. But in practice, many states, okay, many countries have limited access to inexpensive disposable syringes over the counter, okay, as part of their effort to try to discourage drug use. Okay, the fact that prices for drugs are higher in an underground market creates an incentive for people to use, even more so than would be true in a legal market, to consume in a way that is cost effective, that gives the biggest bang for the buck. So instead of taking a pill that contains an opioid, okay, people inject, because injection gives you a bigger rush, a bigger dosage per unit, okay, compared to smoking or swallowing or other things. So yes, there's restrictions on clean needles. So people have shared those needles and they've injected to a greater degree. And that certainly was one significant factor in the spread of HIV in the US and other countries.
Of course. Now I want to talk a little bit about the harder drugs. And this is actually the concern that I had going into the research, which is that while I probably support the legalization of drugs such as marijuana, perhaps the public might be a little bit more concerned about harder drugs such as opioids. For example, previously the government was a little bit lax with opioid regulation in its understanding about how opioids functioned, and that led to people not having, it was basically an information asymmetry between these companies and the people who are purchasing opioids. They didn't understand perhaps the risks associated with it. So under a libertarian framework, how would we handle these harder drugs?
Okay, so I have a bunch of responses. So first, the labels as to which things are harder drugs or not are somewhat arbitrary and don't necessarily coincide with the degree to which those drugs are harmful or likely to be harmful. It is certainly true that all available evidence says it's impossible to OD on marijuana. So in that sense, it seems like it's a less dangerous drug, whereas it is obviously possible to OD on opioids and some other currently banned drugs. But the libertarian framework, the economicsy framework, says that what's crucial in determining harm is not the substance per se, okay? It's the circumstances under which people are able to consume it. And so we talked about overdoses as one crucial aspect of that. Okay? The harms come from prohibition, not necessarily the quality of the substance, or not mainly the quality of the substance. And so the analysis applies to every drug, whether it's a hard drug or a soft drug. Okay? There have been prohibitions, okay, of things like blue jeans in certain communist countries. There have been prohibitions of alcohol. There have been prohibitions of all sorts of things, which have led to black markets and all sorts of violence related to the enforcement of contracts in those underground markets, something I should have mentioned earlier. Okay? That's a result of prohibition, not the characteristic of the substance that's being prohibited. Okay, so that's sort of the first point. I would disagree a bit with your characterization of the opioid situation. In fact, opioids were highly restrictive even before the opioid crisis started, in the sense that you could only get opioids by seeing a doctor and having the doctor write a prescription. And doctors were generally very restrictive and only prescribing under very specific, narrow circumstances. And that meant there was a substantial demand left over, okay, that expressed itself in the black market. Okay, now, during the roughly end of the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, doctors started prescribing opioids much more broadly. So there was more sort of legal access. But it was still the case that if you had been prescribed and the doctor stopped being willing to continue, you couldn't then just go to some store and keep buying the opioids on your own. You wouldn't have been able to do that without a prescription. And so many of those people went to the black market, and the negative effects, the overdoses, in my analysis, come mainly from the fact they went to the black market, not that they had prescriptions for opioids or were on prescription medicines for extended periods. There's very little evidence to support that the prescription use is by itself, okay, a major contributor to the negatives from opioids. You're surely right that as a matter of sort of political economy, as a matter of convincing the public, it's much easier to convince the public to legalize something which seems safer. And marijuana indeed does seem safer. Okay? But people use opioids for years, some cases for decades, for pain relief. And they hold down regular jobs. They, relate to their friends and their family, and they maintain basically normal lives. Indeed, huge fractions will claim that they lead much better lives because the use of opioids allows them to control the significant pain that they might have from a shoulder injury, a back injury, all sorts of other conditions. And so people are we should be taking account of the fact that people are made better off by having access, okay, to those drugs, even if those drugs do have some potential to be misused and have very serious negatives. You can think of a zillion other products or activities that have the potential to be misused and have very negative effects.
Right.
And yet we don't outlaw those. Cars is one example. Downhill skiing is an example. Bungee jumping is an example. Playing tackle football is an example. All those things sometimes cause really serious harm, but very few people assume we should ban them. Instead, we try to find ways to reduce the harm relative to the benefit of being able to engage in those activities.
Of course, and now I stand corrected. Well, Professor, thanks so much for coming on. I really enjoyed listening to a different field of thought almost. It's not every day that you read news and data and political thought about libertarianism. So thank you so much.
I'm afraid you're right. We don't hear about it as much as I would like, but we're trying to make it more accessible and more widely held.